I knew something was wrong the second the pilot scanned my identification card. His expression froze, like a man who had just seen a ghost. Then, the screen in his cockpit turned blood red. An alarm blared, and 4 words appeared in harsh military font. Alert, Admiral Ghost, maximum security. Before I could even breathe, 2 F-22 Raptors rolled onto the runway, engines screaming, forming a military escort on either side of the jet. The handheld tablet in the pilot's grip continued to pulse with that violent crimson light, displaying my clearance level as top secret SCI Yankee White classification. Without a single word, the pilot snapped into a rigid, trembling salute, his eyes fixed forward in absolute deference. I did not stop to reassure him, and I did not bother to smile. I simply stepped into the cabin, leaving his confusion and the heavy scent of jet fuel behind me. Welcome to the Turning Table Stories channel. Sitting here with my coffee, I'm struck by how easily we misjudge the silent strength hidden in others. Where are you watching from, and what's your favorite drink right now? I look forward to your comments. But as I entered that cabin, the real reckoning was just starting. The private jet leveled off at 30,000 feet, the hum of the engines becoming a steady background vibration that usually signaled luxury and calm. But inside the cabin, the air was thick with a different kind of pressure. William, my fiance's father, and a man who treated Silicon Valley like his personal chessboard, did not even wait for the seatbelt sign to turn off before he went on the attack. He leaned forward, his face a mask of practiced corporate dominance, and slid a thick leather folder across the polished mahogany table. I did not reach for it. I did not have to. I knew exactly what it was before he even opened his mouth. It was a zero-asset prenuptial agreement, a legal cage, designed to ensure that if Jack and I ever parted ways, I would leave with exactly what he thought I brought into the family: nothing. "Read it, Jordan," William said, his voice dripping with that familiar condescension, "and sign it before we reach the summit. My son is brilliant, but he is a romantic. He does not see people for what they really are, but I do." He paused, looking me up and down, like a bad investment. "I have looked into your Navy record. Aerospace liaison, it sounds like fancy bookkeeping to me. You have spent years pushing paper in the shadows, while people like me built the world you are trying to marry into." I looked at the folder, then back at him. I did not cry. I did not feel my heart race or my palms sweat. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. I felt the weight of my training settle over me like a familiar cloak. In my world, we talk about the invisible chain of the survivor. People often mistake silence for weakness or compliance for a lack of spine. They do not realize that for someone who has lived in the high-stakes world of intelligence, silence is a tactical choice. It is the restraint of a hunter who has already locked onto the target. I was not being quiet because I was afraid of his money or his influence. I was being quiet because William was currently playing a game where he did not even realize the rules had changed the second I stepped on this plane. Just as he started to lean back, a smirk forming on his lips, the cabin lights flickered. A shadow swept across the window, followed by a roar that seemed to tear the sky in two. 2 F-22 Raptors suddenly surged through the clouds, locking into position on either side of our jet, their metallic skins glinting like silver knives in the sunlight. William yelped, his smug expression shattering as he grabbed the armrest so hard his knuckles turned white. "What is that? What is happening?" he stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward the window. I did not answer him. I did not move an inch. I simply stared into his eyes, watching his billion-dollar confidence crumble in real time. This was not revenge yet. This was accounting. I let the deafening thunder of the jet engines answer for my unimpressive bookkeeping. I sat there, the folder untouched between us, a ghost in a navy dress, watching the man who thought he owned the sky realize he was just a passenger in mine. I leaned my head back against the cool leather of the jump seat, the distant, rhythmic thrum of the Raptor engines vibrating through the fuselage and into my bones. My eyes closed for a second, and the hum of the jet transformed into the ambient noise of that high-end bistro in Palo Alto, where William had first tried to buy my silence. He had spent the entire evening treating the $1,500,000 wedding budget like a hostile takeover. He spoke in the language of Silicon Valley KPIs, synergy, and market positioning. He did not see a wedding, he saw a branding exercise. He would mention a price tag for the flowers or the catering, then look at me with that same sharp, calculating gaze he probably used on a failing startup. "Jordan, you have to understand the stakes," he had whispered, leaning over his $300 steak. "Jack is going to inherit a legacy. This wedding is the first step in showing our partners that he has chosen a partner who understands the value of an empire. You are a pleasant girl, but your background is a distraction. We need to ensure that your middle-class sensibilities do not dilute the Dawson name." I had simply nodded and kept eating. My Navy years had taught me that information is the only currency that matters, and William was bankrupt in that department. He saw a marine biologist with a fancy bookkeeping military past, never stopping to ask what kind of bookkeeping required, a federal-level designation that surpassed his own security clearance. He did not know that the satellite network his data centers relied on every day was protected by the very protocols I helped establish. He was a man who lived by status, thinking identity came from titles, bank accounts, and reputation. He could not conceive of a power that did not need to bark to be felt. As I sat there, listening to him describe me as a gold digger to his associates, after a few glasses of scotch, I did not feel the need to defend myself. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a hint of regret for the silence I was maintaining, but there was only clarity. This was not a family dinner, it was a business transaction, and I was the only one in the room who actually knew what the assets were worth. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years, taking my humility for granted, while they feasted on the security I provided in the shadows. William thought he was the architect of his world, but he was just a tenant, living in a structure I had helped reinforce. Now, back in the cabin of the jet, the silence between us felt heavy and clinical. William looked at me, then at the F-22s, then back at me, his jaw still tight with a mixture of suspicion and fear. He was realizing that the girl he had dismissed as an afterthought was actually the Admiral ghost. He was starting to see the cracks in his own reality, the realization that he had been judging the part of my story he could see, while ignoring the chapters that truly mattered. This was not a breakdown of our family bond, it was an audit of his character, and the results were coming back as unacceptable. William was no longer the composed king of the boardroom. He was pacing the narrow length of the cabin, his footsteps heavy and uneven on the plush carpet, as he shouted toward the open cockpit door. "This is a mistake. Do you hear me? A clerical error." His voice cracked, losing its rhythmic authority. He turned back to me, his face a blotchy shade of red that clashed with the pristine white of the jet's interior. The cabin began to smell of his expensive cologne and the sharp, sour scent of unmasked fear. "I do not know what kind of game you are playing with the flight path, or what favors you called in from your old Navy buddies," he hissed, leaning over the table until he was inches from my face. "But this charade ends now." He stabbed a finger at the leather folder containing the prenuptial agreement. "Sign it, right now. If you do not, I will call my board members the second we land in London and strike Jack's name from the $10 billion merger deal. He will be left with nothing because of your ego." I did not answer a single one of his accusations. I did not even blink. I simply went back to my internal spreadsheet of the mission. I had been the silent investor in their version of family for too long, and now I realized it had been a subscription, with me footing the bill. They mistook my silence for weakness, treating my kindness like a bottomless credit line they never intended to repay. But today, the account is closed. This was not a breakdown, it was a balance sheet, and William Henderson was deep in the red. William stumbled toward the cockpit, shouting threats of immediate termination and legal ruin from his blazer, the physical manifestation of his only weapon. "I will double your salary. Triple it," he yelled at the pilot. "Just tell air traffic control there has been a mistake. Tell NORAD we are a private civilian flight and we do not need this theater. Get those jets away from my plane." The pilot did not even look at him. He did not acknowledge the money or the threats. He kept his eyes locked on the horizon, his hands steady on the controls, but I could see the way his shoulders were set. He was not afraid of William's bank account. He was in awe of the person sitting in the jump seat. "Sir, please remain seated," the pilot said, his voice taut and professional, ignoring the billionaire who signed his paychecks. "With respect, Mr. Henderson, this flight is now under protective protocol because of her designation." He gestured toward me, and for the first time in years, William looked like a man who realized his signature did not carry any weight in the room. "Designation?" William whispered, the word tasting like poison. "She is a middle-class bookkeeper." I finally looked up from the table. My eyes were clinical, reflecting the cold, lethal gray of the F-22 Raptors gliding through the clouds outside. I saw him not as my future father-in-law, but as a liability that needed to be neutralized. "People who live by status think identity comes from titles and money," I said softly, my voice cutting through the hum of the cabin like a blade. "People who live by service know identity comes from character and action. You have spent the last hour proving you have neither." The cockpit door clicked open with a metallic finality. The pilot stepped out, his spine as rigid as a structural beam, his eyes completely ignoring the man who signed his paychecks. He did not look at William's desperate, empty threats or acknowledge the desperate bribes. He looked directly at me. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steadying itself into a formal cadence I had heard 1,000 times in briefing rooms across the globe. "The escort formation is locked. NORAD confirmed your Yankee White classification. We are approved for immediate ascent to 38,000 feet." William sputtered, his mouth opening and closing like a failing circuit in one of his own data centers. What does any of this have to do with her? This is my aircraft. I demand you get those jets away from my plane." The pilot gave a short, curt nod, one that was more of a professional dismissal than an acknowledgement of authority. "Mr. Henderson, you no longer have authority here. This aircraft is now operating under Naval Command jurisdiction. Please remain seated." He gestured toward me as if I were something sacred, and for the first time in his life, William looked like a man who realized his signature did not carry a single ounce of weight in the room. I stood up slowly. I did not ask for permission, and I did not glance at the prenuptial agreement folder, still sitting on the table. I walked past William, my movements guided by muscle memory and a cold, clinical focus. As I entered the cockpit under a Naval Command override protocol, the air felt different, concentrated, and professional. "Ma'am," the pilot continued, handing me a headset with the stiff, formal posture of someone addressing a superior officer. "We have also received message traffic from the Naval Security Coordination Center. They request confirmation of your final destination so they can adjust ground teams accordingly." Ground teams. The words hit William like a physical blow as he stood frozen in the cockpit doorway, pale and sweating. "Ground teams? My what?" he whispered, his voice sounding tiny and fragile against the roar of the engines. I took a slow breath and clicked the transmitter. "This is Admiral Ghost," I said. My voice was steady as bedrock, the voice of a commander who had managed world events that would never appear in a newspaper. "Tell the Security Coordination Center to stand by. Ground assets are to remain in staggered shadow position until I provide final coordinates." I was not Jack's fiancé in that moment. I was a naval intelligence liaison, a high-level asset whose identity was buried beneath years of service to protect more than just myself. I was a fast tracker, one of the youngest to ever reach this rank, thanks to a decade of operations that the public would never know existed. This was not a family dispute anymore, it was an operation. I had been the silent investor in the Hendersons' peace of mind for too long, and now I was performing a clinical audit of the reality they thought they owned. William Henderson had spent his entire life thinking power was something you could buy, print on a check, or display on the side of a skyscraper. He did not understand that real power is intrinsic. It is a protocol that activates the second you step onto the tarmac. I looked at him through the cockpit door, shrunken, confused, and suddenly very small, in his own leather-lined world. You are asking questions you do not have clearance for. William, I said softly, using his name without the title he cherished so much, stripping him of his status, the way he had tried to strip me of my worth. And you probably never will. I turned back to the flight panels, my hands moving with lethal precision to lock our course. The jet lurched as we adjusted our pitch, climbing higher into a sky that now belonged entirely to the ghost. The calm of the cockpit was shattered by a sharp electronic chime over the intercom, 2 pulses, urgent and professional. Then the pilot's voice crackled through my headset, taut with focus. "Ma'am, we've just received a distress alert from a nearby civilian flight. They were experiencing a total navigational failure, and their autopilot had dropped offline. They were flying blind at 35,000 feet. I leaned over the console, my eyes scanning the transponder data. My heart did not skip a beat, but my mind instantly cross-referenced the tail number. It was a private jet belonging to the global tech group. Specifically, it was the personal aircraft of the CEO William was desperate to merge with in his $10 billion merger. The man William considered his only equal was currently 3 minutes away from a catastrophic descent. I did not ask for permission. I clicked the transmitter. "This is Admiral Ghost. To Civilian Charter 79 Delta," I said. My voice was like polished steel, sharp, cold, and unbreakable. I told them to breathe, to find neutral pitch, and to follow the shadow of our escort. Outside, one of the F-22 Raptors peeled away from our wing, sliding into position above the falling star like a guardian phantom. I didn't rely on the jet's public Wi-Fi. I pulled out my Navy-grade encrypted tablet and connected a physical RSA security token. Within seconds, I was bypassing civilian filters to access the tactical interface directly. In my world, a synchronized network is an open door. I accessed the private flight logs and the secure server links William had been using during the flight. I was looking for patterns, but what I found was a smoking gun. William had not just been checking stock prices, he had used 3 different shell companies to funnel payments to a civilian background check firm. He had paid them to illegally scrub my Navy record and plant false entries of financial fraud to present to Jack. He was trying to frame me as a scammer to save his own ego, but in doing so, his hired hackers had attempted to breach a Department of Defense firewall to access my Omega file. The second their malware touched a classified naval server, it triggered a silent alarm at the Pentagon. This wasn't just a dirty investigation anymore. It was a federal felony against national security. He was not just a toxic father-in-law anymore, he was a felon. I looked back through the cockpit door. William was standing there, his face drained of color, his hair disheveled, as he watched the digital display of the rescue. He had no idea that while I was saving his merger partner, I was also securing the evidence that would destroy his life. The narrative had just shifted. Inside, the cockpit glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. This was not a family drama anymore. It was an indictment. The jet touched down in London, under a heavy, charcoal sky, the tires screaming as they met the rain-slicked tarmac of a high-security private terminal. Outside the window, the 2 F-22 Raptors maintained their vigil until our speed dropped, their metallic roar finally fading into the background of a city that had no idea who was arriving. Inside the cabin, William was a ghost of the man who had boarded the flight. He was frantically straightening his silk tie and smoothing his blazer, trying to summon the mask of the tech mogul one last time. He still thought he could spin this. He still thought his $10 billion deal was the most important thing happening on this runway. The stairs lowered, and the cold, damp air of London rushed in, smelling of wet asphalt and finality. Standing at the edge of the tarmac was a line of black armored SUVs, their blue and red lights pulsing rhythmically against the gray morning. In front of them stood Marcus, the CEO of Global Tech Group, the man I had just guided through a near-fatal navigational failure. William shoved past me, his face twisting into a practiced, hungry smile. He stepped onto the runway with his hand outstretched, already launching into a speech about the unfortunate delay and the strength of their partnership. Marcus did not even look at him. He walked straight past William, as if he were a piece of discarded luggage, and stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me. Marcus, a man whose name was synonymous with global power, snapped to attention and offered a crisp, formal salute that signaled he wasn't just a CEO, he was a man who recognized a superior rank when he saw one. "Admiral Ghost," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the wind. "You saved my life, and you saved my company. I owe you a debt that a merger could never repay." William's hand stayed frozen in midair, his jaw hanging open, as he watched his only equal show sacred reverence to the woman he had called a worthless burden. Then, the special NCIS investigators stepped out from behind the SUVs. William's knees buckled. He turned to me, his eyes red and wide, his voice cracking, as the narcissistic armor finally shattered. "Jordan, please," he whispered, sounding shrunken and pathetic. "Think of Jack. Think of the family. We can fix this. We can find a family solution." I stood my ground, my expression clinical and cold. This was the illusion of power from an empty wallet. William lived in a world where human worth was just a number on a balance sheet. He did not realize that wealth is a rented status, but character is an owned asset. When the currency changed from dollars to life and death integrity, his entire hierarchy collapsed because he had nothing underneath the money. I reached into my bag and pulled out the leather folder he had shoved at me 30,000 feet ago. I did not sign it. I did not even open it. I simply handed it back to him. "You told me I should not touch anything on this plane, William," I said, my voice cold and unwavering, like a winter storm hitting the coast. "I am taking your advice. I will not touch a single piece of your falling empire." I walked past him toward the waiting SUVs, leaving the billionaire alone on the tarmac, clutching an empty folder and a legacy that was turning to ash in the London rain. The legal storm that followed our landing in London was swift, clinical, and absolute. William Henderson's empire did not just fall, it was audited out of existence by NCIS investigators who had been waiting for a reason to look beneath his shell companies. The $10 billion merger was dead on arrival, and the man who once barked orders at pilots and boardrooms spent his first night on the ground being questioned by NCIS investigators about naval security violations. Jack stood by me through the fallout, but his eyes were finally open to the truth about the man who had raised him. Jack realized that his father's strength was just a series of loud demands, backed by a checkbook that had finally bounced against the law. Our wedding did not cost $1,500,000. There were no bridal magazine photographers, no custom designer gowns that cost as much as a house, and no 5-star catering menus. Instead, we stood on a quiet stretch of the California coast as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of lavender and soft orange. The only music was the sound of the Pacific tide rolling against the shore, a gentle, rhythmic hum that felt more sacred than any cathedral. I wore a simple white dress, Jack wore a navy suit, and we exchanged vows, grounded in truth rather than titles. The money I had saved over the years, the funds William thought were insignificant, became the seed for something real. Jack and I established the Aerospace Liaison Foundation, a quiet organization dedicated to helping veterans transition their specialized skills into high-tech aviation roles. We did not do it for the applause or the tax breaks. We did it because service does not end. When you take off the uniform, it just changes form. I have come to realize that some of life's most important chapters remain closed to the world for a reason. Real power does not need to be displayed on a balance sheet or shouted from the cabin of a private jet. It is the steadiness you hold when everything else is falling out of the sky. It is the character you keep when no one is watching, and the integrity you refuse to sell, no matter how high the bid. If you are listening to this right now, and you feel like the outsider, the one who is constantly overlooked because you do not have the loudest voice or the biggest bank account, I want you to know that I see you. You are not a worthless burden or a bookkeeper in the shadows. You are a guardian. You are the one who carries the weight, so others do not have to. Never let someone who measures life in dollars tell you what your soul is worth. Wealth is a rented status, but the strength you forge through service and sacrifice is an asset you own forever. Forgiveness is not always about the other person. Sometimes it is the only way to set yourself free from their expectations. I forgave William, but I did not let him back into the cockpit of my life. I chose peace over performance, and I found a future that did not require anyone's permission to be luminous. Never judge a person by the part of their story you can see. Everyone carries chapters you know nothing about, and some of the greatest heroes are the ones walking quietly among us without a medal or a spotlight. If this story reminded you that your value is found in your character, not your bank account, hit that share button. Stay with us for more stories about the quiet power that truly moves the world. Your presence here matters.